Hi, this is Shruti. I have something exciting to share with you. The Indian Political Economy program at Mercatus has launched a new fellowship called the 1991 Fellowship, where we're searching for India's next generation of policy thinkers, doers, and leaders rolled into one. If you're an early career policy analyst, lawyer, economist, or researcher working on pro market reforms or hope to be one, we want to hear from you. We're offering fellows up to $35,000 a year for a period of 3 years to dive deep into a state-level policy idea or reform that you care about. The fellowship follows the spirit of Emergent Ventures India, seeking out high-agency individuals early who want to pursue ambitious policy ideas that expand human flourishing in India. Applicants must be based in India. Applications are now open, so if this sounds like something you or someone you know might like, please consider applying at mercatus.org/1991-fellowship. Welcome to Ideas of India, where we examine academic ideas that can propel India forward. My name is Shruti Rajagopalan, and I'm a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Today, my guest is Renuka Sane, who is the managing director of TrustBridge, an institution that seeks to improve India's business environment by improving the rule of law. Renuka was a member of many expert committees, including the task force of experts set up by the Employees Provident Fund Organization, the research team of the Bankruptcy Legislative Reforms Commission, the Pension Advisory Committee of the Pension Fund Regulatory Development Authority, and the Working Group on Personal Insolvency at the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India. She received a PhD in economics from the University of New South Wales. We talked about the old, new, and unified pension scheme and the related reforms over the last few decades in India, India's broader financial regulation framework, separation of powers when it comes to regulatory authorities, the way regulatory orders are written, and much more. For a full transcript of this conversation, including helpful links of all the references mentioned, click the link in the show notes or visit mercatus.org/podcasts. Hi Renuka, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Shruti. Glad to be here.
You're my go-to person for a lot of things, regulation in India, how individual regulators work, but you're really my go-to person for pensions and pension reforms, which I think nobody really understands. And I would love to geek out with you on all things related to pensions. But before we go down that path, for those who are unfamiliar, can you just lay out sort of the broad contours of how India's pension system works and who it touches? So my understanding is there is, of course, a narrow group, which is the civil services and government employees. And then there is the private sector with a different set of options. And then there is a vast informal sector who for the longest time had none of these opportunities, and now slowly mechanisms are being brought in for those people also. So can you just give us the lay of the land before I start asking you very specific questions on, the different pension schemes we have and what reforms we need?
Yeah, sure. When we think about pensions, we are generally thinking about how to finance consumption in old age. We are all going to retire, at least those of us in the formal sector are going to retire at 60. And because of increasing life expectancy, we are going to live for 25, 30, 40 years more. And whatever money that we can save now has to be built up such that it can then be drawn down in those years where we don't have work and we don't have any other source of income. So that's essentially the idea of having any kind of a pension. Now, the question is, where is this money going to come from? Either the government pays this money and says, look, you are working. When you hit 60, 65, you pick a number, and I'm going to use current taxpayers' resources and give the money to the older people, right? So all those who are working pay X% tax. I collect this money and then I go give it to everybody who is old. That is typically how pensions are thought of in other parts of the world. till we started running out of money, and still we realized that actually, because of the demographic transition, there are many more old people and very fewer younger people to actually finance this, and funding of these kinds of pensions became a problem. And that was true in the case of India as well. So earlier, for civil servants only, you had this sort of taxpayer finance pension, which promised you that, on retirement you will get a certain sum of money, and that would last you every for however long you live. We would give you this kind of a payout, and this would be financed through taxpayers resources, right? That would be it's an element of public finance. So that's really how we have thought of pensions traditionally. This, like I said, began to be problematic because it's hard to find the money to do this. And so pensions started now becoming what we call as defined contribution funded programs, where we force you to save money in some account, and that money then grows over a period of time. We force you to lock that money into that account, so we don't let you touch that money. And then at the time of retirement, there are various ways in which you could draw down that money. And that's the sense of a pension system. So, of course, you will argue that, but all of us save money. Whether you save it in an account that is called pension or not is irrelevant, because what matters is how do you finance consumption in old age. And by the time you're 60, 65, or ready to exit the labor force, do you have enough wealth that will last you for the rest of your life? What we have done and what the world has done has said that, oh, but people are myopic. And so we've got to force them to save money in some account called a pension account. In India, we do it through the Employers Provident Fund, or we do it through the NPS. By and large, these are the two main products that are available. And we force people to put money there. And then that money grows. And then we let people take a lump sum, or we force people to buy an annuity so that there is some money left for retirement. So that's in effect what we mean by a pension system, that it is mandatory, it is illiquid, and ideally, there should be some sort of a drawdown policy around that, right? So, of course, you could just take it as a lump sum, as we do in some schemes, that the day you retire, whatever is in your account becomes your pot of money, and now you do whatever you want with it. Alternatively, we force you there also to not take the money in one go, and we stagger it over your lifetime so that the money lasts for your lifetime. So that, in a sense, is really the idea of a funded pension system, or a defined contribution individual account pension system, that we are all forced into saving money for our retirement.
This is super helpful. So, the defined benefits, which was the old system, versus the defined contributions. My sense is the core idea is the same, right? So, what are we really trying to solve for? We're trying to solve for, dignity in old age, eliminating old age poverty, consumption smoothing, removing these kinds of social problems that will emerge if there's a large number of people who are sort of left without means. But the sort of risks that are there are different in both cases, right? So when we're talking about defined benefits, it's basically a question of fiscal sustainability. And it's a question of sort of like the political economy of who is paying for what. So then you have a very large young population which needs to pay into a pyramid scheme of sorts for what is the older population. So you need to take from one group and you need to give it to another group. If we switch it to defined contributions, then the risk is a little bit different, right? Which is now there is going to be a fund where you've contributed your entire life, but that fund is going to rely on markets. And we don't know what happens to markets, and we don't know when someone will retire in the business cycle, and whether those funds are being appropriately managed, if they're being appropriately regulated. And there is a political economy problem on that end also, that you can't just say, oops, something bad happened, global financial crisis, COVID, and leave someone with an empty bag or with a shallow bag. Is that the appropriate way to think about the two different risks? One is fiscal sustainability sort of at the government level, and the other is how much risk can we impose on an individual given that they have very little choice in how the system is designed and they are forced to pay into it, but there may still be a chance that they don't get the amounts that they're hoping for.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a very good framing. where in the defined benefit system, the risk is on the government or the employer, if the employer is the one providing the DB system. And here, the investment risk is pretty much on the individual. That's absolutely right. I'd just like to point out that while most of us think that when governments pay, it is pretty much riskless, even as an employee, that the government is never going to renege on your pension. But that's not always true. We don't measure that risk appropriately because defaults don't happen that often and don't happen in such a binary way as 0 or 1. But there are many number of events even within India where governments have delayed pensions. So a lot of people don't get their pensions on time. Certainly, if you are lower down the bureaucratic order, many states have reneged on pensions. Many states just pay pensions later than when the money is due. In the rest of the world also renege on promises by later changing the retirement age, for example. So, when you are 25, you're told that the retirement age is 60. But by the time you're 55, you're told that, oops, now it's 68. And of course, in places like France, you can have riots on 1 or 2 years of extra work life, which,
Yeah.
really it's very amusing to see that when you're sitting in India. But nevertheless, so it's not as if government systems are not don't have any risk. They do. We just don't measure it well and we don't see it well. Okay. And it actually hits us when we are 75 and 80 and pensions are delayed. And are we going to run pillar to post to get that money? Of course, it doesn't happen all the time. So I concede that.
It's funny, you say this. When I joined State University of New York, the first person you meet is the HR person, right? And they walk you through all the
Right.
benefits. It was the first time I was getting vision and dental insurance and all, as it
Mm.
was my first real job, right? So I was almost in tears and feeling thrilled. Then she asked me to fill out the retirement paperwork. And there was the option of defined benefits. SUNY was still providing defined benefits pension scheme, okay? Versus defined contributions. And I picked defined contributions. And she looked at me and she said,
Hmm.
"Are you planning to leave in a couple of years?" And I said, "No, I'm not. It's a tenure track job. Like, why would I leave?"
Yeah.
And she said, "Why are you picking defined contributions as opposed to defined benefits? It's the stupidest thing you're ever going to do. Like, this is a very generous pension scheme." At which point I was like, I don't have faith in the New York State system to actually pay me by the time I age. And she literally looked at me like I was insane. Okay.
That's right.
And
So,
I guess I was cracking like a cute economist joke, which did not land well. And she thought I was totally irresponsible. But
right.
obviously, economists study these tail risks. We know about these defaults. We know when municipal governments and state governments and pension funds default. So I guess it's very salient in our mind in a way that it's not salient in a regular person's mind. So it's just when you were talking about that, I was literally reminded of my own life. And eventually
That's
I
right.
got tenure, but I did leave SUNY. So the defined contributions worked out great for me, but just putting it out there.
And I think, as defined benefit pensions also lock us into labor force choices that may actually not be good for us, because once you're locked into that kind of a system, you don't want to leave because maybe your vesting period requires 5 years more, and then there's the next 5 years for something else, whereas a defined contribution system does give you the flexibility to make better labor force choices. But coming back to investment risk, yes,
Yeah.
there is investment risk in defined contribution pensions. There's no doubt about it. But there are a couple of ways in which that can be mitigated, and many systems offer those kinds of sort of design choices where these risks can be mitigated. For example, you could just reduce your exposure to equity as you age, and you could be in more fixed income instruments as you age, so that if a financial crisis hits, you're probably not going to face a big shock around the time of your retirement. Then there are things like passive investment choices. So instead of doing active investment, you could do passive investment. And so that kind of tracks the broader index, and it's likely to give you higher returns net of cost than active investments. At least that's what the literature from the OECD countries shows us. In India, there is still some sort of a debate on whether active is better than passive, but we haven't had that many years of a mutual fund industry to actually be able to calculate net of costs, whether active is better than passive. But across the world where you've had these systems for many, many decades, you know that passive investment does better. So there are all of these kinds of things that you could do to mitigate investment risk. And I think one point that none of us appreciate that much is that there is no such thing as a free lunch. If you want guaranteed returns, then you eventually have to pay for it one way or the other.
Or someone has to pay for it.
That's right. Someone has to pay for it, or you as a taxpayer eventually ends up paying for it.
Yeah.
You don't measure how you are paying for it, but it's there. And, in India, for example, we love guaranteed returns. Whether you look at EPFO or many other schemes, the ones that do well is where you're kind of told you'll get 7% guaranteed return or 8% guaranteed return, as opposed to a market linked scheme where you don't know what you're going to get. But what you're paying with there is the lack of an upside, because when times are good, you are absolutely foregoing the 12% that you could have gotten year on year for a guaranteed 8% return. Now, that may still be a reasonable choice for some people to make for whatever your risk preferences are and wherever in life that you may be. I just don't think that any of us are thinking in that way. And certainly, people in the lower income groups are thinking that way, because the price of the guarantee is not made explicit. And therefore, there is just such a fear about the worst case outcome on the bad side without looking at the best case outcome on the good side.
Yeah.
And I think that we make a mistake focusing too much on the investment risk by A, not showing that there are alternative ways to deal with it, and B, not making the price of the guarantee more explicit. Because once you did that, you would know that this is not free and that you are actually paying for it, and you might be more in a place where you could make this choice more rationally.
Yeah. So, earlier in India, if I had to just like do the blunt version of it, government employees were largely in defined benefits category, and private sector earlier, in the 50s started out as defined benefits, then they were much quicker to switch to defined contributions, right? And then in India, sorry, go ahead.
No, so I think we got the EPFO in the 50s, and the EPFO is sort of a defined contribution scheme. It is mandatory for those in firms with 20 plus people in certain sectors. And it applies, I mean, it has some wage thresholds where it applies to people below a certain threshold. It looks defined contribution, but it is not in the sense that the returns are guaranteed.
Yeah.
So it's not defined benefit because it doesn't tell you that you're going to get, let's say, 50% of your last wage drawn as a pension. But it is not a pure defined contribution because you do get a guaranteed rate
Because it's
of
backstopped.
you do get a guaranteed rate of return. So it's sort of somewhere in the middle. And then we started with the employees pension scheme, which is a defined benefit component of that entire package. And then, that is defined benefit. And I think that one doesn't know how much trouble it is in.
Yeah. So now in this world, that was the earlier sort of like, let's say government sector is almost entirely defined benefits. The private sector has this mix. But overall, there's a tiny fraction of India that works in this formal white collar world, right? With all these benefits. We're talking single digit within the employment force.
Yeah.
So two questions here. Why has the government pension scheme sort of dominated the conversation so much when it's such a tiny fraction and, 98% people are outside of that scheme and may have no retirement benefits or contributions defined? Like, there's nothing going on there. So why is this so big in terms of, taking up space in economists' mind? Is it just a question of how big the fiscal outlays are, or is something else going on there?
Yes, I think that in the early 2000s, when we were making the change from the old pension system to the new pension system, it was big because it was really costing a lot of money. In the early 2000s, we were spending almost 2.5% of GDP on just pensions. Now, for a country like India, that's a pretty large number.
That's
And
huge.
by certain estimates of if you calculate the implicit pension debt, it was sort of almost 60% of GDP, which is sort of the net present value of
Yeah.
all the future payments today, right? So these numbers were beginning to look very bad in the early 2000s.
And this is for less than 1% of the workforce, just to put it in
Exactly.
context, right? So it's an
Exactly.
enormous fiscal burden for a very tiny fraction.
That's absolutely right. And many states were actually in a lot of fiscal trouble at the time and were unable to pay their salaries and pensions on time. So, when I was talking earlier about governments reneging, it has happened.
Yeah.
And not so long ago that people's pensions weren't paid on time or governments reneged. And so at that time, it was felt that we should do something about this fiscal burden and that we should move government employees from the defined benefit pay as you go system, as it's called, to something where it's defined contribution, where the funding burden does not fall on the government. I mean, of course, the government is paying 10% or 15% now into the employee's account, but that's where it stops, right? So I've made the contribution and then it's over, so I'm not taking the burden of the longevity risk on myself. So that's why it became big at the time. It's become big now because government employees, while tiny, do have a loud voice and they are able to comment on whatever they don't like and bring about change. Though it's not very clear to me whether this feeling of unhappiness on the NPS is pervasive or it is amongst sort of a few more vocal groups within the larger community of government employees. So one doesn't know that. But certainly there was a lot of noise in the last couple of years and a lot of unhappiness about the NPS and about not having any guarantees on the pension.
Yeah. So NPS is basically there is a defined contribution scheme. It all goes into a managed fund, right? And you can annuitize a portion of it and take out a portion of it in lump sum. Is that about the rough
That's right.
design of it? Okay.
That's
So
right.
now
That's right.
within this, I assume they were upset about the annuitized portion that there isn't a floor for it, right?
I know. I think it was a little more than that. One is that there was no guaranteed return.
Okay.
So NPS was entirely market linked. And so, 10% of your income, and earlier it was 10% of government's income, which was later increased to 14%, was put into your pension account. This money was managed by three public sector pension fund managers. So it was your account, it was not pooled. And then, that would grow. At the time of retirement, whatever your accumulation was, you had to annuitize 40% and you could take 60% out as a lump sum. Now, what happened was that because all of the government employees were actually in these public sector PFMs, pension fund managers, and there were far stricter investment guidelines on them
Yeah.
in the sense of the amount of equity exposure they could get. I think that the returns that they got in the earlier years were not as great as we would have expected. People then began to worry that when you retire, you would not get 50% of your last wage or 50% of your last 10 years average. And therefore, that amount would be lower than what you would have gotten if you were in the old defined benefit plan.
Yeah.
Secondly, so this was one. And I think the other big issue was that government pensions, the older ones, are inflation indexed. So
Yes. And the pay
you know,
commission keeps
and
revising that.
pay
So that
commission
number
keeps
only goes
revising
up,
that.
it never goes down.
Exactly, exactly. Whereas in a market driven system, it is very expensive to buy an inflation index annuity if you get one. So it means that whatever, even if you were somehow able to get 50% of your last drawn salary, as pension because your NPS investment account did very well, there was no way in which you were going to match the inflation indexation that
Yeah.
a future pay commission would give you. And I think that was the other reason that a lot of government employees, and I guess if I was one of them on this topic of inflation indexation, I would I wouldn't mind a good inflation index annuity myself. So,
So, okay, I have a
so
question here. So, in 2004, when the NPS was actually introduced, I can understand if people were really upset about it from 2004 to 2014, right? Because we've had global financial crisis, Indian markets are not as sophisticated yet. We don't have, inflation targeting policy yet, right? We don't have the MPC. So, we're all over the place that time. Now it seems like our markets are much more sophisticated. The mutual fund market's absolutely booming, right? We finally have inflation targets. Our inflation is very much under control within the bands. The MPC has done a pretty good job. It feels strange that the complaints are coming now. So, is this really about inflation indexing the annuitization, or is this just people getting greedy and saying, my grandparents got something else and I'm getting something else? It just seems a very odd choice because these are also civil servants. They know how bad the fiscal situation is. It seems bizarre to want to go back to the old pension scheme.
I think that two things happened. A, which is that, when the NPS was started in 2004, if you joined service then as a young person, you would not have retired by now, right? There are still some years to go before 30, 40 years get over. However, if you joined the NPS when you were 40, for whatever reason you joined service then, or you were a contract worker, but then your position got regularized, as they say, then you were already 40 and now you are at the end of that cycle, and actually in 20 years you haven't accumulated much. So, for all these people, I think the NPS was a bad experience. And I think this is a design failure, that you should not have let people who are, who don't get 30, 40 years in the system and don't get enough time to actually accumulate that kind of money in their accounts. Because really, investment wealth is a question of compounding over long horizons, right? And so if you don't get those long horizons, then you're not going to get adequate wealth in your pension account. And I think there was a little bit of disappointment on that front. I think there was also some disappointment around what happens if a employee dies while in service. So the old rules were, I think, quite generous in what the family got if the person died while in service, whereas I don't think that the NPS design had thought about that adequately. But then again, I would argue that that was a very easy solve. The government could just have bought group life insurance for all its employees as a big purchaser of insurance from any of these insurance companies. It could have gotten very good rates. That group life insurance would have solved for this problem. So I think some of it was design failure and not enough attention being paid to the problems of NPS as it was evolving, because all of these are things that you learn over the 10, 15 years where it played out. And of course, the poor investment choices in terms of just sticking to just government bonds and not letting people enjoy the benefit of the equities. And the earlier years, the equity markets did so well and all of the government employees did not get anything out of that pie. So some of these design choices did go wrong, and you had disappointment amongst those who were at the receiving end of the NPS situation. And I think that's one reason why this became a big deal. The second reason why this became a big deal is that many state governments were going into elections, and this got used as sort of one way to get the government employees' vote to say, look, I'm going to give you back this generous pension. And again, I mean, it puzzles me why
It's such a
government
tiny group.
employees, yeah, and why that group is so important from a vote bank perspective. It's something that I haven't quite, understood. We need to talk to a political scientist, I think, to figure out what's going on here. But that's where we are. It really became a political issue when many state governments started to go into elections. I think Himachal Pradesh, Punjab, perhaps a couple of others did announce that they were going to go back to the old pension system, and they did announce that for their state government employees. And so then this became an issue with the union government employees as well. The puzzle is that they've now gone to this sort of a scheme called a unified pension scheme, which is neither NPS and nor OPS. I just want to make one point, which is that if government employees were so anti NPS, Why haven't many of them switched to the UPS? And I think that's again a puzzle in front of us, but we can talk about that later.
Yeah, so when I look at your paper, so you did one paper with Ajay Shah in 2011, then another one with Susan Thomas in 2014. And if I read the two papers together, basically you're telling us all the design issues with NPS, exactly what you pointed out, which is it was like too tight as a regulatory system. It never gave them the upside. It gave them very little control, which meant you're neither relying on the government nor are you getting the benefits of the market in some sense. And when I look at the second paper, it seems like you're like, still NPS is overall a pretty good idea. We just need some minor tweaks and reforms to figure this out, right? So, first, am I reading the two papers correctly?
That's absolutely right. Yeah.
Okay. So now there's a third part to it, which is exactly what you're talking about, which is this unified pension scheme, right? So now this unified pension scheme gets us most of NPS, but also some of the old pension scheme systems in terms of guarantees and backstops and so on. So, first of all, that doesn't seem like the reforms you guys suggested. So, what is
Yeah.
it that they were thinking when they did the unified pension scheme? Like, what are these people smoking? It
You have
seems
to ask them
bananas
that.
to me.
Yeah, you have to ask them that. But I think that it is a way to continue with the benefits of being in some sort of a market driven scheme, but with providing a floor,
A floor.
right? So where you're kind of giving 50%, you're promising 50% of the last drawn salary or the last 10 years drawn salary. So you're giving a 50% replacement rate, and you are giving inflation indexation because you're saying that the pension will increase through the pay commission increases on dearness relief or dearness
But
allowance.
now you're back in the fiscal mess. That's the crazy
Absolutely.
thing, right? Exactly what you wanted to avoid, you're back in it.
Yes. So what you're doing is that you think that you are going to avert this fiscal mess because you still have this 10% of the employees contribution, and now it's 18% from the government that is going to be invested in these. There's a pooled account and there's an individual account, and somehow this money is going to be enough to pay that pension when the time comes. So that's the hope. But as we know from past experience, that even though this is slightly better than just sort of taxpayers money going from one place to another, many of these kinds of these schemes actually do run into trouble as time goes by, and so we do run the risk of having a big hole in the UPS funding structure as time goes by. We'll find out over the course of the next 20-30 years. Though, like I said just a minute before, that as of now, not many employees have switched to the UPS.
Yeah.
So they were given a choice to move between the NPS and the UPS, and very few people have actually switched to the UPS. Is it because they're waiting it out to go back to the full OPS? Or that they think that the UPS is sort of somewhere in the middle? You might as well stick with a cleaner NPS type pension system. I don't know. Or is it that, the deadline keeps getting extended? So when it's the final deadline, suddenly you will have a whole bunch of government employees moving towards the UPS. Again, like all of these things are things that we are going to find out over the next few years and decades.
Yeah. So this is still, I mean, this is the looming problem because it's just so expensive and it's a political economy problem. My sense of why the state governments are so eager to push this, I don't think it's vote bank politics. They're too small a group and I don't think they're enough to swing the vote and they don't vote in a unified way. I think it's because they are worried that the business of government would just stop without the government employees. Every other voter promise that they're making is going to be in deep trouble if these guys go on strike and, these guys just basically refuse to cooperate. They kind of need them. So that's my, public choice 101 read of the situation, but it seems quite bizarre to cater to this group.
Yeah, I have two responses to that. One, if that were true, why aren't more people moving? Right? So why do we not see people switch to the UPS? And so what is this demand for the OPS and U or what is this demand against the NPS stand really about? We need to find that out a little bit more. And I think for some state governments, I can imagine that they had a lot of people who were the old civil servants in the old pension scheme. So you were paying pensions for them. And for the new guys, you are also paying this contribution rate in the pension account. So, in some ways, the burden on the state government
It's
today,
pretty high.
until all of the old people retire, is pretty high because now you're kind of bearing the burden of both these systems. Whereas once the old people retire,
You mean die, not retire, right? Die. Sorry.
yes, yes, that's right. Yes, and their spouses too, because you do promise
So
family
we need a
pension.
large
So
number of people to die to make this feasible.
that's why it sounds really horrible to say, but yes, I think that that fiscal burden probably became a bit much for state governments, and many of these state governments, I think Rajasthan as well in that list, that moved from the NPS to the OPS, were state governments that had fiscal trouble. Maybe this was one way to save the money on the NPS at the moment. Don't contribute, and when these people retire, we'll see whoever is governing at that time, it's their headache, not ours. So that is also public choice 101 in some
Yeah.
way, right?
Yeah.
That it's not my problem, it's the next person's problem. And that probably also explains why many state governments just made that switch.
Now, if we move away from the government, which is again takes up a lot of noise and room, but is a tiny fraction and is very costly, you've also looked at how do we expand the private sector sort of pension and benefit scheme that we're talking about, because the private sector, which is formal and white collar, is still pretty small. And then, you have your paper with Susan. This is your JDS paper where you're talking about how to think about a much wider participation, right? And here, my sense of how you're approaching it is this is sort of virgin territory. We can design this ground up, right? Because we still have this huge pool of informal labor and they're barely getting wages, let alone getting retirement benefits. So there is a way to design this system smartly and sustainably in a way that their benefits are portable, that they can actually use them when they need to without being an enormous burden on firms. So, walk me through that design. What is a good way to think about inclusion where the bar is not so high that they'll automatically get excluded and remain informal, but the bar is not so low that it stops mattering?
Yeah, I think, and my views on this have shifted a little. So in 2015, when we were doing this work, the government of India had started a co-contribution scheme. Anybody can open an NPS account.
Yeah.
And if you were in the informal sector, and informal sector is defined through certain thresholds, if you put in 3,000 rupees in a year, then the government would put in 3,000 rupees for you for the first 3 years. That was what was promised. And these small sums of money over time can actually lead to a reasonable amount of wealth. And in this way, you are able to capture those that are kind of above poverty line and so
Yeah.
can save some amount of money, but are not rich enough to be employed in the formal sector as we define it and then become part of one of these other systems. Now, our sense at that time was that once you give these co-contribution type incentives, then a lot many people will participate in these programs, and that's what our data from the early experience has shown us, and that's the JDS paper that you're talking about. That yes, this is possible and this can lead to outcomes and good outcomes, and we were looking at persistency of contributions, right? So if I am a poor informal sector worker and I put in money for 1 month, and then maybe life takes a bad turn the next month. So do I kind of put in the money or do I just forget about this? Am I able to be persistent with my contributions? Or maybe 1 year was a bad year, but do I come back and put in money when times are good again, right? And we did find that there was some continuity where people were coming in to put in money into their pension account. So that was what my thinking was then. Where I have shifted my position a little bit today is that this is incredibly expensive to do.
Yeah.
So, one way in which you get in the informal sector to put money in their pension accounts is this retail channel of customer acquisition. And that's where I think that this it becomes problematic, because any retail channel to get customers is a very expensive channel, because fund managers then have to start going and doing advertising of these kind of schemes, and then you have to pay large incentives to intermediaries who have to go and convince you and then collect money from you year on year. And suddenly then this becomes like any other mutual fund or insurance scheme, where you have like this large numbers of intermediaries trying to get money from retail customers. And I'm beginning to think that that is too expensive a proposition. And so if you want to do pensions on scale, the way to do it really is to find some sort of wholesale participation, that you can't go to every single individual household and then try and convince that household to put money in pension accounts, because then it's not sustainable. What you need to do is to find some sort of organizations where you will get bulk membership. You go to some unions, or you go to an Uber or an Ola, and then all drivers just get onboarded at the same time, and then it's their account and they manage it, but the onboarding and the customer acquisition costs really go down. And I think until you are able to do that, I'm a little skeptical of a how much you can get done through this route, and more importantly, how much should you get done through this route, because this A is very expensive. We've seen a lot of consumer protection issues in other sectors when you have an intermediary led financial inclusion model, and that's not a good thing to happen to pensions.
Yeah.
And C, this sort of assumes that unless you save money through an account that is called a pension, you are not doing anything for your retirement, which may not be true, because people have different ways of thinking about how they will finance consumption in old age. Maybe everybody's saving in gold, and we might not. We might think that that's not a very optimal way to save, but it's not that people aren't doing anything. So, an inordinate focus on pushing savings through something called as a pension then takes away attention from the fact that there are multiple ways through which wealth can be built up. And if pensions are becoming very expensive to do onboarding and to get people into these accounts, perhaps we have to think differently about it and start to measure what people are even doing with their retirements. For example, in India, that it might be more useful to save in your children. Returns to human capital might be higher than returns to gold or some fixed deposit, because
Or to buy a
uh,
house, because
or
that's
to
the
buy a
one thing
house.
that becomes very difficult
Exactly.
in the old age.
Exactly. And I think therefore today, if you look at most of India, it is not that old people are living on their own and taking care of themselves. This is a very elite urban phenomenon for most of India. And whatever little I have seen in the household data, most elderly folks live with their children. And so it's the
Exactly.
kids that are financing your retirement. And so you financing their education to get them a good job may not be such a bad idea, or may not be such a bad investment choice when you are
Even a
at that
centuries old
in
investment choice, right?
exact when you especially when you are in that income bracket. So I'm beginning to kind of say that, look, we shouldn't push the retail pensions model too far. We will end up with the same consumer protection issues that we have ended up with in insurance and mutual funds. The industry will probably then just try and get to those people who have money, and the informal sector may just get left behind anyway. And we need to kind of broaden our idea about how we are thinking of financing consumption in old age.
But it's also, you raise a really interesting point. Like, there's a lot of this cute nudge economic stuff, which is this cute behavioral economics, behavioral finance. How do we get people to start saving in bank accounts and avoid usurious money lenders, or put in pension schemes by giving them incentives? The thing that the micro experiments always miss is how costly this is to do at scale. Right? And that's exactly what you point out, which is you can do this cute nudge lab experiment, and the moment you scale it to population size, it's now an administrative nightmare
Absolutely right.
without the benefit, right? So the nudge economics is not costless at all.
No, no, absolutely. And one must worry about the slight possibility that the nudge is a wrong nudge.
Oh, that's a
And
very big possibility. I think we should more than worry about that.
I know, I mean, you know how I meant it, that everybody who thinks that the nudges and the behavioral economics is the way to go is not worrying adequately about what if I am wrong about the nudge, right? Where is this faith in the designers of the nudge coming from? And I think that worries me and that bothers me quite a bit. So of course there are rules of thumb that are always very useful.
Yeah.
And I think I would kind of invest my money in rules of thumb type of financial literacy. You give out this information to people and let them make their own choices. I'm not a big fan of going too far with the nudging and those kinds of experiments.
So, I guess here I would ask you, because you've done work both on India and you've also looked at this global sort of, comparative literature on how do we think about inclusion? So, in this sense, like, is India not at that point of development yet where we start worrying about inclusion of this level? Like, should we just say, hey, let's get our people employed and let's give them opportunity? Don't worry about nudging them into cute pension schemes? Or is it something else? Like, are we missing the boat on what India could do at its current state of GDP per capita and also state capacity? Like, is there some low hanging fruit that can be picked for people who are in the informal sector?
I mean, I think the first thing that we have to do is just solve the problems in our financial sector so that there can be a plethora of products and choices for the informal sector. Because what do I know what products are useful to one category of workers versus another category of workers? So this idea of a universal product is a little problematic. And when we think of inclusion, we've got to ask, what is the product design that might be useful to different groups of people across the country, and why is it that we are not seeing those kinds of products and instruments? And much of the answer probably lies in financial regulation and how we conceive of products. And I am sympathetic to the regulators that people running away with other people's money is a big problem.
Yeah.
It is very difficult to solve. We've seen scams around chit funds, for example, where, people just lose their money and then where do they go? And at a local level, it is incredibly difficult to find out where money is being lost and where is it being stolen, and what is really the fraud that is going on, and how do you sort of tackle this? So it's not an easy problem to solve, I get that.
Yeah.
But we need to think a little bit more creatively about where on the formal side could you allow for more experimentation in terms of the kinds of products that people are allowed to design and allowed to sell. So that sweet spot is something that I think we are missing quite a bit.
So, here, two random asides. So, there's this book called More Than Good Intentions by Dean Carlin and Jacob Appel, right? So, they're very thoughtful about all these RCTs they've done in different parts of the world and so on. They tell this story of this flower seller. I think her name is Vijaya. And somewhere in the south, I forget, I read the book a long time ago, maybe more than a decade ago. So, she had a routine. So every morning she'd wake up, she'd go to the money lender, she'd, borrow the money. Then she'd go to the wholesale flower market, she would buy what she needed. And then she'd go sit outside the temple and sell the flowers and, turn them into garlands and all. Sell, on her way home, pay the money lender with the crazy daily, usurious interest rates. And then on her way, go home and pick up groceries and things like that. And these people basically sat her down and did the back of the envelope calculations saying, you're paying this crazy amount in interest rate. Don't do that. We'll give you some startup money. And then, every day that you save in the 6-7%, you pay this guy, you can save. And in about 40 days, you'll have the working capital to fund your own, little business. And she hears them very patiently. And then she says, you guys don't understand. My husband's a drunk. If I take any money home, he's going to drink it away. The only person he's scared of is the thugs and the goons on the money lender. So this works out great for me because on a daily basis, I get to do my job. I have the money and I have protection from this guy drinking my money away. So they write, I mean, I'm obviously making up the numbers, I don't remember the example verbatim, but it's like this really sobering example that they give of how these outside people who come in with all these behavioral nudges, they just assume that the person who is saving or investing has no agency and has no clue what they're doing. Like if they're paying crazy, usurious amounts to the money lender, they must be stupid or unable to calculate compound interest. As opposed to what she's doing is very sophisticated, right? She's solving a very sophisticated optimization problem. Not just her behavioral problems, her husband's drinking behavioral problems also. So that I think is, what you say about you want to be careful about how we design these things and how we force people in or out. I think it's useful to like sit on that for a minute and just think a little bit about the kind of hubris.
Absolutely. I'll give you one more example. My colleague Manish Singh and I have a paper
Yeah.
on household investments in gold in India. And we start to look at, why would gold be a good investment for Indian households? And we kind of think that at the lower end of the spectrum, gold beats inflation very well. Given that until we had inflation targeting, we were a very high inflation economy. Gold was a great instrument to be in for that reason. On the richer side, it's a great diversification instrument because it tracks the S&P, and because we don't get access to the S&P other than through LRS because of the capital controls that India has. This is one way to get international diversification because the gold price is made in London and not made in India.
Exactly.
And so once you start peeling in the layers, you begin to say, oh, but in a country where you have these kind of capital controls and you have these kinds of frictions around inflation and access to finance, etc., gold may actually not be such a bad investment.
It's done really well in 2025, for instance.
That's right. That was the one thing, the one research paper of mine that had some implementable insights. And so after I did the paper, I went and bought some gold ETFs. And I said, chalo, at least one paper in my life has actually helped me financially.
It's funny. I always have this conversation with my mother and my aunts and all that I'm the first generation of women in our family who buys gold for fun. And my actual gold investments are in ETFs. I buy my jewelry purely for consumption and fun and not as a
That's
future
right.
investment or a hedge against
Right.
inflation or something like that. So
Yeah,
so that's an interesting to be able to save in gold ETFs is a good privilege.
absolutely. And to have a good, well diversified portfolio that is not entirely in gold is also a privilege. And all of us should make the most use of it.
So, so one part was this inclusion exclusion thing. Now, the second part, which you were alluding to within inclusion and exclusion, is how the rest of our financial markets function, and they're not that well regulated, right? So, all the state capacity and regulatory problems we have in these markets are eventually going to enter the pension markets if kind of force these unknown instruments for opt-in or nudge or something like that. So can you briefly walk us through what are those problems? Like, what are the regulatory problems we have in regulating existing instruments right now? Investment instruments, pension instruments?
I think I'll begin with insurance first because that's where we've seen the largest problem. For example, up until almost 2010, 11, we had these products called, well, we still have ULIPs, but at that time we had the unit linked insurance plans, which were largely investment products with a thin layer of insurance on them. And they had pretty high commissions to begin with, and then they had certain product features which were detrimental to the consumer's interest. And you had these intermediaries trying to sell these ULIPs to consumers and ask consumers to churn, because insurance is also a long term product, right? I mean, ultimately the point of insurance is life insurance, and it's not to actually invest your money. And Monica Hallan and Susan Thomas and I have a paper where we kind of estimate how much money was lost by consumers because of the mis-selling of these ULIP products, and the amount is almost 28 billion US dollars in a
Wow.
span of 7-8 years. After that, there were some changes to the regulations on ULIP products, but we've had these endowment products in insurance for a long time. which also merge the investment side component and the insurance component, and they give you very poor returns, and yet they are one of the largest selling products in insurance. They have one of the highest commissions and actually are a very bad deal for consumers. So Vimal Balasubramaniam, Aditi Dimri, Olga Balakina and I have a paper where we kind of show in that paper that the a term insurance plus PPF actually dominates an endowment insurance product at any age. And so it's really a bad place for you to be in. And yet you find that pretty much everybody is there because you have all of these commission rules which incentivize intermediaries to go sell that product that earns them the most commission and is not really in the benefit of the customer. Now, why is that so? Because there are difficulties in how you have one behemoth called the LIC, and then you have some private sector players, and then LIC is also very fiscally important for the government. And so it's very difficult to rock the boat on that front. And then there are, of course, financial literacy is a big problem on the other side as well. So insurance is a very good example of the problems of consumer protection in finance and financial regulation in these markets. For a long time, mutual funds were also like that. And then there were caps on mutual fund commissions. And then you moved from a front loaded commissions model to a model where you get commissions on trails, which then incentivizes the broker or the intermediary to make sure that the person stays in the product. Because then, as an intermediary, earn more when you continue being in the product, and then that's good for you, and that's good for me, and there's incentive alignment there. We see that there are some of these problems in many of the financial products that are being sold, and they might permeate to pensions as well if we just do the same kind of the retail strategy for pensions.
Yeah. Now, how do you think the world has changed after 2016, right? So, a lot of this work is done a decade ago. We've had the geo revolution. Now, everyone has a mobile phone, right? We've had the Aadhaar and the UPI revolution. Everyone and their mother is playing Ludo on their phone. Apparently, India is the largest like futures and derivatives market. Like, it's insane, right? How people are treating markets like it's almost like gambling tiny sums of money on a daily basis without very sophisticated levels of financial literacy. Is there Do you think about the inclusion problem differently now? You don't have to go knock door to door, right, to get people to sign up. So now you can have a gamified version of this. You can have big UPI players kind of involved with some basic incentives to have people opt in. Is there a way of rethinking your inclusion stuff from 2015 now that we're in 2025?
Oh, yes, absolutely. In fact, just like when you swipe a credit card, if you have the pipe to your NPS account, you could have, 10 rupees per 100 rupees spent or 10 rupees per 10,000 rupees spent, that then just goes automatically delivered to your pension account. And similarly through your UPI, right? So every time you make a UPI payment, 10 rupee top up could go from your account to your pension account. And I think that that is eminently feasible today. So at least from a design perspective, I think that's a great way to go. That said, I would worry about the current frauds in the UPI system. So
Absolutely.
even on payments, we are doing so badly on the question of frauds. We have not been able to solve that problem. That I feel until we manage to get that right, linking it to pension accounts may lead to some, other issue. And so me losing money while paying somebody is one thing, but then me losing money when something's going into my pension account or my pension account, then, you know, there is access to this pension account to others, then I think that's an orders of magnitude problem, a higher orders of magnitude problem. And so I would worry about some of these design things a little bit. And then that goes back to questions around the structure and design of UPI, and then the incentives of the players to do fraud management, the structure of the MDR itself. So you start getting into those issues around how UPI is made, who can come in, who can go out. about.
But it is solvable, it seems like those
Absolutely.
questions are solvable at a much smaller sort of cost to the exchequer than getting 1 billion people signed up for anything, right? So
No,
it just
absolutely
seems like
right.
that's a better trade-off now that we've built the pipes and the plumbing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's certainly in terms of, at least pension products and linking to the NPS would be the right way to go. The sad thing is that many states have come up with these gig worker products, and even the new labor codes have started talking about pensions for gig workers, and the simplest thing to have done would have been to open NPS accounts for them. You've got a great system here, you've got
Yeah,
good pension fund managers, and by getting these gig workers to open NPS accounts would have been the right thing to do,
yeah,
and then you could have thought of these plumbing issues for them. But we have not. And some states have gone ahead and set up their own kind of, administration boards to look at pensions of gig workers. And I think that that's a terrible way to do
yeah.
pensions. And we are not thinking about this clearly yet. Though I must say that very recently I heard that Zomato has signed up with HDFC Pension and
Nice.
to put their,
Gig
I
workers
I
on
don't know
there.
what they're not workers. Yeah, they're gig workers, but
Gig
I think one runs
employees,
into
gig
the,
something.
you can't call, no, gig something, right? Because the minute you call them employees, it becomes
Employees, yeah. You run into all the
problematic again.
statutory problems.
Exactly. So the gig people
They're people who take
into
things from point A to point B.
to point B. So there is some movement on that front, and that would be the right way to go. It fits in with what I was saying on wholesale participation earlier,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah. And also, I don't want to minimize your scam issue because, I recently read Snigdha Poonam's book Scamlands. And I think that might be the episode that comes out just before yours. We had a
Oh,
conversation a few
right.
days
Okay.
ago. And it is terrifying the scale at which insurance scams are happening. Like entire villages and cities are involved, in the Northeast. It's a little bit terrifying. So I wouldn't want to minimize the scam element of it. And once scam elements enter something big like the pension scheme as opposed to tiny chit funds here and there, then you're basically poisoning the well, right? So we want to be really careful and thoughtful about how we integrate other systems
Absolutely.
into NPS, basically. But it's still a design issue, I think, that is fixable, relatively low cost, given what everything else you're saying.
No, no, absolutely right, Shruti. But I'll add one more element to this, which is not really about building up investment wealth, but it is about drawdown of wealth. So sure, you are able to fix this by by somehow getting money into people's saving accounts or pension accounts. But what we've really got to think about is then how is it that they're going to draw down this money? And very often we think that, retirement is age 60, 65 because that's what our employers say. But for a lot of people in the informal sector, the idea of retirement is meaningless. It is really an exit from the labor force, right? You stop
Yeah, they
working
need the
when,
money when they need the money.
yeah, I mean, you stop working when either you can't work anymore or you think that you've made enough money and you want to stop working. It's entirely your choice and not forced upon you through some employment contract that, at 60 or 65, you will stop working. And I think that those are the kinds of questions that we need to focus our attention on. That when is it that a person has access to this money? How is it that this person draws down that money? Would you have different rules for someone, let's say, who's been a construction worker and is not likely to live past 75? Would you give access to that person at 55 versus somebody who's had, a desk job or and a healthy lifestyle and so is likely to live to 85, 90? How does your sense of access to that
Yeah.
pot of money and drawdowns from that pot of money change based on who that person is? And these are very important questions for us in to answer because we have such a wide and diverse informal sector labor force, and I assume that life expectancy experience for these large groups of people is going to be so different that we've got to think about it differently from how many OECD countries have thought about it.
Yeah, it's not one size fits all to start with. But here I feel like we could get creative at without rocking the boat too much. So, for instance, the biggest issue we have with pensions, right, and drawing down the amounts is you don't want people to do it in a hot period. right? You want people to think about the question carefully, right? So no one should just be able to withdraw all the money and get scammed, or their children withdraw all the money or something untoward like that, or they do it in an emergency without realizing their options. So you could very easily have cooling periods, right? So if you make a withdrawal before you're 65, right? So you can make a tiny withdrawal at any age you want, but you have to wait 1 year before you put in a request to make a bigger withdrawal, right? Most people who have a pension scheme, I think, can manage cash flow for a year. It won't be easy. It'll be tough. It might be usurious. It might be family and friends and so on. But a 1 year cooling period to withdraw money at 50 doesn't seem outrageous to me. So now, instead of saying we're going to have different rules for different people, you could just say we have one rule, which is there's a longish cooling period of 1 year if you do it at 50, there's a 6 month cooling period at 60, and so on, and then go from there. And most people will figure it out.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it sounds like a good idea, but again, how would you decide 50 and 60, right? On what basis are we kind of even arriving at that age? I feel a little unsure about how to pick that particular age. My exit
Do
from
we
the
have
labor
good
force is such a
actuarial tables for this? I mean, we have pretty decent
y-
actuarial studies on how long people are going to live and, rough life expectancy in different states or different regions. I mean, this is quite precise calculation.
this can be precise calculations, but I'm not sure that we have good life tables for the full population. I think that the life insurance industry does have good tables for the segment of the population that they cover, but I'm not sure that that extends to the whole of the country. And in fact, this is something that, the government could actually, this becomes like a public good, right? Where you are
Yeah.
able to put out this data,
Yeah, you create the data
and
set. Yeah.
you create the data set around life expectancy and
You
mortality
don't even
experience of
calculate births and deaths properly. What are you saying?
exactly, exactly. And so
Right. So
I
now
think
that
that
that has to
yeah,
happen at the local level, right?
exactly,
Local municipalities and gram
exactly.
panchayats have to now correctly start recording births and deaths.
Exactly. And so now you begin to see the scale of the problem on how
Yeah.
you would arrive at it. Though, again, I mean, in the absence of this data, you will just have to pick some thumb rules and, like
Yeah.
say 50 or 60 or whatever it is. But we will have to have different access age, I think, for different sets of people. And how you arrive at that is, again, a question for people to think about more carefully.
Yeah. Do you mind if we switch over a little bit away from pensions? I want to talk about some of the other stuff that you've done. And for me, I mean, you work on so many different things, a lot of, regulatory issues in the financial sector. I encourage everyone to go look up your website and read all your papers. But the one thing that you do, which is quite unique, that hardly anyone else has worked on, is regulatory orders, right? So here, India in the post-liberalization world, this is really in the last 25, 30 odd years. Once we moved away from the command and control system, we had basically greater reliance on markets. And once you have greater reliance on markets, you need, there's greater reliance on regulators. So a bunch of these regulatory agencies and statutory agencies were created, and they were given all kinds of powers. So, this could be SEBI, it could be the telecom regulator, right? It could be the bankruptcy regulator. It could be all different versions of the kinds of regulators you need in a functioning market economy. But India has, like many other parts of the world, this problem of regulators becoming sort of sui generis and sort of all powerful, right? So they are Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh all combined. So they are legislature, executive, judiciary all rolled into one. And their orders, sometimes we don't know if they are making law, if they're enforcing law, or if they're interpreting law, right? Or they're executing. So this becomes a really complicated thing. So there are two parts to this. One is, how do we even think of these orders? And then the second part of it is, how should we write these orders? And you've actually, done a fair bit of work on both of these. So before we get into the orders for the super geeky law and econ fan listeners, can you tell us a little bit more about the regulators and how the system operates before we talk about the importance of the orders and what you're doing with it?
Sure. As you mentioned, regulators are like mini states that they fuse all kinds of powers in one agency. So SEBI, for example, writes law, it makes regulations, it has executive functions, it does inspections of brokers, for example, and then it passes orders against regulated entities. So if I am accused of insider trading, then SEBI will conduct the investigation on me. Well, SEBI will first write the regulations on what
Yeah.
constitutes insider trading. Then SEBI will conduct an investigation on me. And then the SEBI adjudicating officer or whole time member will write an order against me.
Yeah.
I can, of course, defend myself, but ultimately it is still the same SEBI, if
Yeah.
not the same person within SEBI, that is writing these orders against
And
me.
there's only one option, which is an appellate authority, which is supposed to be different from SEBI, but we're not sure how different.
No, I would think that no. I think that yes, the Securities Appellate Tribunal, I would think, is separate from SEBI, though it has had problems in terms of staffing more recently. I do think that the Appellate Tribunal, you can go to the Appellate Tribunal and hope to get a fair hearing there. Of course, let me not open the question of the design of tribunals and the problems and the issues around this concept of a tribunal. Maybe one day we will discuss tribunals, but I don't want to raise that question here at all. We'll just stick to the regulators in this episode. So the regulator is doing all of these things at one time, and then that makes you ask the question, how is it that the regulator is performing on all of these functions? Because this has an inordinate amount of influence on how markets work, because a large number of markets today are actually under these statutory regulatory authorities, and all of these decisions are made by these SRAs. And so it becomes important to ask a bunch of questions around how they are performing each of these functions. Is the regulator itself following the rule of law? Is it following the things written in its statute in how it must do adjudication? And those are the questions that we began to ask at Trustbridge. Can we evaluate the regulator's performance on its adjudicatory function? Because we get access to all of these orders. We know what the SEBI Act says that SEBI should do, let's say, when it comes to imposing penalties. Is SEBI doing that? And so that's the kind of work that we started to do.
So
We've
is
done
this
work
sort of a do we
on.
follow our own rules question? Is it that core level rule of law project?
Yes, do we follow our own rules? Because this is important, because if we don't, then there is uncertainty and unpredictability in the market, right?
Yeah.
You do want that the regulator follows the rule of law when doing its adjudication function, when doing any of its function for that matter. So we started with that. We made a list of benchmarks that we think SEBI should follow based on its own act, based on certain basic principles of natural justice. And then we analyzed all SEBI orders on insider trading and saw whether they did this or they don't do this. And we find that there are many gaps in the way SEBI writes its order. Many things are missing. One important thing that is missing is, the SEBI Act says that if I have to impose a penalty on you, the amount of penalty must be based on factor ABC.
Yeah.
What is the unfair gain that you have made? And then the penalty has to be proportionate to the amount of money that I have made illegally. Now, what we find is that many orders do not have this amount. They say we are not able to calculate this number, but and so we are going to, put some minimum penalty on you. Similarly, when SEBI goes ahead and passes orders on debarment from capital markets, so I say now I'm just debarring you from doing business, and the question is, but on what grounds and what is the rationale that you are giving for imposing such a sanction on me? And we
And
find that
also
there
for
are
how
several.
long and what is
That's right.
proportionate, right?
Exactly right. And so we find that there are many gaps in the way SEBI is conducting this function, and we need to now figure out how to fix it. So we have then gone ahead and done some work around, so what makes a complete order? How do you know what is a complete order? And so we have, from theory, come up with some benchmarks around completeness of an order. And now we are working on a tool where you put in any order, and then it'll tell you that on these aspects the order is not complete. And these benchmarks are a combination of, sort of benchmarks that are common to everyone, like the date of show cause notice should be written in the order. Okay, I mean, there are these basics that you've just got to get right, and these should be part of any order, whether it's a CCI order or a SEBI order or a electricity regulatory order. It doesn't matter. And then there are benchmarks that are specific to the question at hand. So if you're doing SEBI insider trading, there are certain things that should be there, like me being able to establish whether you are an insider or not. That's where we need to start, right, before we can move ahead. And similarly, whether it's electricity or competition or whatever, you will have different benchmarks based on what is the specific regulator and what is the specific violation that you are looking at. And so we are in the process of building these benchmarks and a tool where you can just put in an order and it'll tell you everywhere that the order is missing. And the hope is that we can deploy these at regulators and in the public domain, and so that everybody's quality of information will improve as to the quality of the order. And once we know that the order is missing XYZ, we can then push for change in how some of these regulatory orders are written. I'd also like to mention that, while we keep complaining about SEBI and any other regulator, the king of all these regulators, the RBI, doesn't even put out
RBI.
its orders in the public domain,
Yeah,
right?
it's
So we can't
crazy.
even study what the RBI is doing. And I think that is problematic, and we need to write about it a lot more and talk about it a lot more, because all we get from them are press releases. And so that is certainly an area of work. I don't know how to do the work when I don't have the data, but that is certainly an issue that we need to push for and get a little bit more transparency around the orders that the Reserve Bank of India is putting out or not putting out at the moment.
Though, there's been a nice movement. Recently, I saw that they have pulled together 600 master circulars and,
That's right.
pulled
So
it
many
together in
times, yeah,
one rule book or something. And I was like,
yeah.
okay, death by 1,000 cuts is now maybe death by one book or something, which makes me, honestly,
Yeah,
it's an improvement. I'll take it at this point. So I want to go back to this as a rule of law project and just sit with it for a minute, because I think what you're doing is important, but not just in the context of financial markets or like, CCI or SEBI or, whatever, your insurance regulator, your electricity regulator. What we've kind of missed out in Indian jurisprudence is rule of law from a procedural point of view. Right? In India, rule of law is only substantive rights. How many more human rights can we tag on to everything? Right? Right to live with dignity in old age is the way the rule of law for pensions is written into our constitutional jurisprudence. But it's not written in saying this is how your pension regulator should work and this is how your insurance regulator should work and so on. So, this procedural rule of law, which is actually the only way I think of rule of law, and most, the long term jurisprudence on rule of law comes through, is this granular work of how are we writing orders? Did we get the dates right? Did we give show cause notice? Did we, give them a right to refute whatever the Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh kind of concocted and imposed on them? Is there an appellate tribunal? So many little tiny details is what we really need. And the way you've managed to get to it is, hey, when we were command and control economy, it didn't matter quite as much. Now we're a liberalized economy. It relies on markets. Markets require certainty and markets require fairness and non-arbitrary, rule making or order making. Otherwise, the entire system will just clamp down, right? All investment clamps
absolutely.
down and so on. So it's an interesting way to think about the broader rule of law jurisprudence, I think. Is that how you think about this, or am I reading too much into what you're doing?
No, 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 you're spot on. And I'm so glad that you got it right, which means that we are saying something
Hmm.
on our website that, probably makes sense.
I actually haven't
And
read the
you're
website. I've only read the
okay.
papers. So I should go back
All
and read
right.
the
So we are
website now.
all right. So, yes, you're absolutely thinking about it right. That until we get our regulators to function, much of the investment in the economy is going to not happen, because many of these important sectors are now governed by statutory regulatory authorities, as I said earlier. So, how they write regulations, how they conduct the executive function, how they write adjudicatory orders is extremely important and determines how the economy will do in the long term. and in the short term also, I suppose. So yes, that's how we are looking at it. And I get, the first place to start is really measurement. You have to first ask how is it that they are functioning, to be able to know where is it that the problems are and how can we set them right. And so that's the journey on which that we have begun. We are also doing work on the legislative side of things, which is to start saying
Yeah.
how is it that you design regulations. So in the case of insider trading, for example, it's how do you define an insider? Who's an insider? What is this unpublished price sensitive information? When is it that you can say that insider trading is said to have happened? And all of these things are extremely important because they also shape the way the regulator will write the orders. Because if the law and the regulations are not clear, then you will have badly written orders. And let's take the example of fraud. And fraud is difficult, but if you do not kind of draw the contours of where you will start thinking about fraud, then you can't blame the adjudicatory authority for not having the guidance on how to think of a particular case of fraud. So I think these things are quite related, and we are trying to look at it from both sides, from the legislative side and the quasi judicial side, to see where is it that we can do better.
So, there's a third side which we really struggle with in India with most statutes, which is delegated legislation, right? We're just making shit up. Sorry for terrible language, but I don't even know how else to describe it. So, you have the statute, then you have the rules, right? The power to make rules. The rules are whatever they are. And then there are some sort of like a plethora of circulars and notifications and this, that, and the other, which is just floating around all over the place. So at some point, no one knows what the law actually is, right? This is a serious problem at the lawmaking level. To
Absolutely.
me, it seems like the delegated legislation problem is sort of not as bad in the regulatory systems you are talking about because of the same trinity problem, right? We've combined the quasi-legislative, quasi-executive, quasi-judicial functions, which means now because they're rolled into one, you don't have this crazy sort of delegated legislation, except we don't know what is legislation and what is judicial and what is executive anymore. But at least it's contained and you can track it in some sense. Unlike labor law, where I don't know what the circulars say, or unlike land law, where I don't know what the circle rates are, because every week some new circular is issued on what the circle rate is, right? So am I on the right track that this is less of a problem, or at least it's a more contained problem, if not lesser of a problem?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's less of a problem, but it may certainly be contained in the sense that even these regulators do give out circulars and guidelines and FAQs all the time. And
What is
while
with the FAQs? Yeah.
and
Just tell us
while
what the rule is. Like, what is going on? Okay, we'll talk about FAQs in a minute. Sorry, please finish
no,
the thought.
no, no. I mean, I have nothing more to say other than the fact that while technically and theoretically these are not law, whether you are supposed to follow it or not is anybody's guess. And then as a regulated entity, it's just safe for me to follow it, right? Because I don't want to be hauled up, and I don't want an adverse order against me, and I don't want to fight that adverse order and spend time trying to fight that adverse order. So I think that this is the plethora of instruments is a problem. There is another problem here, which is that regulations are supposed to be laid before parliament, and therefore are supposed to get some scrutiny before they come into effect. Now it's another thing that parliament itself does not look at them. And so, you have this problem where, on the one hand, regulators are doing all of these kinds of things, but on the other hand, the parliament is also not doing what it is supposed to be doing in sort of looking at these regulations and discussing and debating these regulations more carefully. So it's a bit of a mess. We have to find ways to go from here. Containing these instruments and at least having them in regulations is a way to start. Also, I think the better our appellate bodies get, the more regulated entities will find the courage to file cases against the regulator. Because
Yeah.
how can you pass an order on against me on the basis of something that's said in an FAQ, or
Yeah.
something that's said in the basis of a circular? And once you have courts starting to acknowledge and uphold these, then I think that's where the pressure for the regulator comes from. Because so far, courts are largely deferential towards regulators, and that's true everywhere in the world,
Yeah.
because regulators are seen as sort of these fountains of
Subject matter
expertise.
experts. Yeah.
Exactly. But I do think that this is changing, because people are beginning to realize that there is a problem here. And the more work that we are able to put out in the public domain, we hope that it gets used to make arguments such as these. And then that finally ultimately gets used to improve the regulatory apparatus and the regulatory state capacity that we see in India.
Yeah. No, I'm totally with you. Now, on the question of the plethora of instruments, I think RBI is, some other level. So, this is my last question of the RBI for you, right? The RBI is kind of an all purpose bank, right? So, it has to manage monetary policy, rate setting, liquidity, inflation targeting, all of that. Another function the RBI has is managing the external sector, foreign exchange, capital flows, and so on. And then there is a third separate matter, which is what you deal with a little bit more directly, which is the supervision and regulation function of public sector banks. And then there's also the supervision and regulation of private sector banks, which is a little bit different from public sector banks.
And you have to add payments to it now.
Yeah. So then there is payments. And then there is also the task of guarding savings, managing deposit insurance, right? There is like DICGC. There's a whole bunch of other things going on. It's the debt issuer to the government. It's also placing like Government of India securities. It's the issuer of currency, which now in hindsight might be the simplest thing that it does, notwithstanding demonetization. So it has all these different functions, and we've obviously rolled it into one, right? Now, there are other countries which experiment with different models where they've separated all these different functions. Let's not get into that. The core of what you are really thinking about is its role as a regulator of the rest of the banking industry, effectively, right? So there is this licensing/delicensing function. They have extraordinary powers with private sector banks. I mean, they can fire sitting CEOs of private sector banks, and they have they can really interfere with the day-to-day running of a lot of things. So what is a good way to think about RBI orders when it comes just to the regulatory and supervision function of public and private sector banks?
I think the first place to start is to have these orders in the public domain. And I mean the adjudicatory orders, right? Today
So
we
hang
only
on a
see.
second. When you say they're not in the public domain, like you're saying they just have like a closed hearing and nothing's out.
That's right. Yeah. You only see a press release that HDFC Bank is fined X crores, or
That's
this NBFC.
bananas.
Yeah. Or this NBFC or that NBFC is fined, whatever. So Amol Kulkarni and I have a piece on the Leap blog on looking at some of these things. And then we also compare how other central banks deal with this.
Well, not by press release, that much I can tell you.
And whatever the press release is a lot more informative and a lot more structured around the information that the regulator puts out. So I think that the first place to start is actually a little bit more transparency around what is happening on these questions, so that the larger public can get to know what has happened, and that sets the
So
stage
what
for.
is the reason they give for not putting the orders out in public? Is
I
there a
think
reason
one
given? Can we RTI it?
I don't know if you will get it through RTI. I think one reason that they give is because banking is kind of sensitive. And if there is a fine on a bank, there might be a run on a bank, because
But
consumers
it's in
then
the press release.
afterwards, right? Much later.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is there's a press release anyway, so the run
Yes.
could happen at any point, right?
But not like when you have a trivial piece of information that you've just been fined so much, and not what you have actually done. So I think that's one of the reasons I've heard people give for RBI not putting out its orders in the public domain. But I really think that this is a huge problem, and that we've got to begin there, because that's when you know what is actually going on the adjudicatory side.
So hang on. Sorry, I'm stuck on this for a second. I understand that the RBI doesn't want like court reporters and television streaming on whatever their adjudication is. But ex post, what's the difference between a press release and the order? Ex post,
I
it's the
think
same thing.
Yeah, but the press release doesn't give, yeah. a lot more
So if you're
information
giving the press release, you might as well give the order, is my point, right?
because in the order you'll have to give your reasoning and you'll have to talk in detail about what actually happened, right? So what is it that you are fining a particular bank for? You may have to put out what was the bank's defense on that, like SEBI orders do. So SEBI orders kind of tell you the whole story, that
Yeah.
they are pretty detailed. So you do get that information out there, and perhaps there is a look.
No, no,
I
I
don't
understand.
know.
No, no, I just want to
So,
belabor this for a second,
yeah.
because the way I think about regulators everywhere is, see, regulation is not cheap, right? Supervisory function and regulation is not cheap. In an ideal world, the regulator needs to step in when the market can't regulate, right? And in financial markets, we're routinely talking about how there's massive amounts of asymmetric information and so on. So the markets can't function in this frictionless way. So we need this regulator to come in. Now, given that this is the nature of the market, why are you making the information more asymmetric? You should make it less asymmetric, right? So that the market can actually regulate and supervise on its own at a lower cost to the regulator. Am I getting this backwards? Sorry.
No, Shruti, this is your next blog where you should start writing about this a little bit more. So we have people like you as well contributing to the debate specifically on this question.
But this is nuts, right? Like, shouldn't you put the order out so that the customers of whichever bank that they are passing the order against are more aware of what's happening with that bank and can vote with their feet and vote with their banker? Like, isn't that exactly what you would want as a regulator?
I would think so.
Okay, so we're on the same page. I'm not crazy. No, sometimes when I read this stuff and I get the ostensible reason, and I know you're telling me that it's the ostensible reason, it's not your reason, I'm like, hang on a second, this ostensible reason makes no sense to me.
Right.
Right? So it's like asymmetric information is the problem, so we'll create more asymmetric information
That's
by
right.
not making the order public. Okay, I'm
That's
okay.
how
I'm
we
just shaming them at this point.
that's how we do consumer protection. We're protecting you from the bad news.
But the thing with all the regulators is everyone wants sunlight and transparency in every other market other than the one they regulate.
I
Because
think that,
their things are like really, really
yeah.
special, right?
That's right. But I think all the other regulators are much better. I mean,
Much.
whether it is at least you see what they have done on the orders. With the RBI, you don't get to see. So, electricity regulators, for example, all of their orders are in the public domain and you can
Yeah.
study them. They go to APTEL and then you hear what
Yeah.
the APTEL is saying, and then they go to Supreme Court. And with a great deal of difficulty, you can map that entire life cycle
I
as we
saw
are doing.
Chitrakshi's piece on this. It's
That's
crazy,
right.
right?
So we do, and the whole mapping from SEBI to appellate tribunal to Supreme
Yeah.
Court, whether it's in securities markets or in electricity or any other market, it's difficult to do because this is not easily available. But you can do it, and then it sheds a lot of light on what regulators are doing and thinking. But with the RBI, it becomes difficult.
So, how much of an appetite is there for stuff like this? Like, I imagine lawyers love this, right? Because for whoever their client is, more certainty is better, right? Even if they are on the penalty side, it's just better to get it done with quickly and to have more sort of certainty, reliability, so on. Who's pushing against this? My imagination is the regulators should want this. Lawyers should want this. People who are in the market as market participants should want this. Is there really a group that is fighting against better orders, or is it just a capacity building issue?
It's a bit of both because the more transparency that you require of a regulator, the more difficult it is for them. So, for example, on a specific issue, both of us are adjudicating officers, and you rule one way and I rule another way. Now, the minute I start saying that, you have to, there is a certain boundary, and then you have to look at the previous order and then justify if Shruti has already taken a certain decision and there is some jurisprudence that has built up, why are you changing your mind about similar set of facts, then that's imposing a lot more work and a lot more constraints on how I think. And I think there's that problem. And the second is then it's a capacity issue.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, the
I think it's a
capacity
bit
issue,
of
I
both.
understand. Our regulators are new. It takes a century to build capacity, right? State
That's right.
capacity, especially. And we've just been doing this for 10, 15, 20 years with slapdash statutes. And, we're kind of building the airplane as we fly it, right? Like our markets are also developing as we do this. And we didn't liberalize overnight. We liberalized gradually in tiny stages. So I imagine some of this will get caught up. But the second part of what you're saying is what I find more disturbing, which is what you're saying is they don't want their hands tied. So, I mean, sorry.
But that is true. But that is true of everybody. And that is
Yeah,
true of every state. I mean,
yeah,
this is a hard won battle in every country in the world.
yeah,
I guess it's not new.
yeah,
If you look at the arc of humanity and the arc of any state. So that's what we've also got to do. And we have to constantly, and as we are seeing in the world today,
yeah,
you have to constantly fight for things that are obvious to citizens and regulated entities, and it's a constant battle, and I think that's what we're in it. And we also hope that we're able to take this to the regulator and actually improve their capacity. So we want to fight this problem at both ends. We
yeah,
want to fight it at the intention and incentives end, because what's in it for the person sitting in that chair to do its job, to do that job better? But even if the person wanted to, then where is the capacity for it? How do you help make that happen? So on the one hand, you have to augment state capacity, but on the other hand, you also have to set the right incentives
yeah,
through the way the regulator is structured or through the way the law is written, so that it incentivizes good behavior of this kind. So
yeah.
I think the battle has to be fought on both fronts.
No, that's both reassuring and worrying. How much work is left to be done. But thank you so much for doing this, Renuka. This was absolute pleasure.
Thank you very much for having me, Shruti.
Ideas of India is produced by the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Help us grow by giving us a rating and leaving a review. Follow us on Twitter at @SRajagopalan and at Ideas of India. Also, check out our initiative commemorating 30 years of India's market reforms at the 1991project.com.